All right, so we're going to look at some examples now that aren't factorable. That's always our first option to solve, but sometimes it's just not going to happen. So what we want to do is try the quadratic formula. There are some other ways that you will learn when a is not 1 especially to factor out a GCF, but we're not going to look at those. We're going to go straight to the quadratic formula if it's not nicely factorable. So the quadratic formula is negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. Now that may look confusing. The plus or minus thing you haven't really seen probably yet. And eventually you'll start talking about imaginary numbers. We're not really going to talk about those, okay? But this solves the quadratic formula. So what we do is we first label our a, our b, our c. Now you can see here a is 6. We don't have a way to factor that right now. So we start to plug things in. Okay, so b is positive 11. So the opposite of b would be negative 11 plus or minus the square root, okay, of 11 squared minus 4 times a, which is 6, times c, which is negative 35. All over, I'm going to extend this over here, all over 2 times a, which was 6. So there's really nothing we do here. Negative 11 plus or minus the square root. 11 squared should be 121. Okay. Now this is like negative 4 times 6 times negative 35. So if I go over here, I can do that in my calculator. So let's see, how do we do negatives here? So negative, nope, that doesn't work. Maybe we don't do negatives on this one. Well, I know I have two negatives, so the answer is going to be positive. So 4 times 6, that's not a 6, times 25 is 600. Oops, it was 35, wasn't it? My bad. Well, I make mistakes too. 4 times 6 times 35 is 840, okay? And that was a plus because I have two negatives. So when I multiply two negatives together, I get a plus. So plus 840 all over 12, okay? So it's negative 11 plus or minus the square root. 121 plus 840 would be 961 all over 12. Now I have to figure out what the square root of 961 is. So if I go back to my calculator here, square root of 961, I don't know always how to use this calculator. Let's do it that way. Is 31. Nice number, works out nice. So basically what I have here, now I can kind of separate this. I have negative 11 plus 31 over 12, and that's where the plus or minus comes in, or negative 11 minus 31 over 12. Okay, so this one would be 20 over 12, and I just simplify that fraction to 5 over 3, I believe. This one would be negative 42 over 12. So that would be simplified to, I think I can divide each by 3, right? So negative 14 over 4, which would go again to negative 7 over 2. Okay, so there should be my two answers right there. Okay, so that's the first example. So let's look at this example. Now this one looks simple. We have a as 1, life is good. But if we really look at this, there's no two numbers that add together to get negative 3. Sorry, multiply together to get negative 3 and add to get negative 1. Just doesn't happen. When we don't have a number there, it's like having a 1 in front. Okay, so the opposite of b, remember it's negative b plus or minus the square root b squared minus 4ac all over 2a. And so the opposite of b would be positive 1 plus or minus square root of 1 squared minus 4 times 1 times negative 3 all over 2 times 1. So that'd be 1 plus or minus the square root of 1 plus 12, because again we have two negatives, not always going to be that way. 1 plus or minus the square root of 13 over 2. Now because 13 is not a nice square root, we don't want decimals and we're looking for exact answers, we can actually leave this just like this. That's our two answers. Okay, if you wanted to write 1 plus the square root of 13 over 2 and 1 minus the square root of 13 over 2, you could. You don't have to.